Voters in Wisconsin risked their lives this week to vote in the state's primary, raising questions about expanding mail-in ballots. But President Trump says voting by mail leads to fraud.
They have to be very careful because you know the things with bundling and all of the things that are happening with votes by mail, where thousands of votes are gathered. And I'm not going to say which party does it, but thousands of votes are gathered and they come in and they're dumped in a location. And then all of a sudden you lose elections that you think you're going to win because there's a lot of fraudulent voting going on in this country.
But is that actually true? Who better to ask than our friend and fact checker, NBC News political reporter Jane Timm. Jane, I feel like I haven't seen you in so long. It is so wonderful to have you here. I think last time we were probably still chatting impeachment. It's been so long.
Yeah, it's been a while. And, you know, here's what we have to look at when we look at this mail-in voting that he keeps going after. He's done this in every of these pressers. We've heard him say, you know, you can't do it. It's too dangerous. People cheat in mail-in ballots. And here's the thing. We've been over this before. Voter fraud is incredibly rare. And absentee voter fraud, here's like the little grain of truth that he's getting at. Absentee voter fraud is one of the more common, if not the most common kinds of voter fraud. But we're talking numbers of frauds in the hundreds compared to billions of votes that are being cast. So it's really a small number. And the president is sort of alleging that there's any kind of mail-in voting would be really, really dangerous. But we don't see evidence of that. And I read the quote that you just played to like one of the nation's leading election experts. And he was like, huh? No.
All right, no seems pretty clear. Jane, there's also a claim that mail-in voting helps Democrats. Any truth there?
You know, you look at states that actually do a lot of mail-in voting, and there are states that try and expand the electorate. So there's states that do. Colorado has a lot of mail-in voting. Washington State, highest turnout in the country. They do almost, I think everything's entirely mail-in ballot there. And they're designed often by Democrats because they want to have more people vote. But I asked an election advocate, a voting rights advocate, does it make it easier for people to vote if they have mail-in ballots? And what she said is it's important to have a lot of options so that voters can take advantage of what works for them. So in a pandemic, of course, mailing your ballot seems like it's the safest way for a lot of people. But she said there's going to be people who have disabilities, who have other reasons that a mail ballot might not work. If their mail's not coming reliably or they don't have a permanent address, you can still vote without a permanent address in many states with various sort of precautions that are there for those people. She said options are really key to expanding the ballot access to everybody. But the idea that this is about Democrats and Democrats are the only ones who benefit from mail-in voting is hooey. Utah, the Republican bastion of Utah, does mail-in voting.
Well, there you have it. Jane Timm, a lot of information circulating out there today. It's important that we get our people the truth. Thank you so much for helping us do that.
Thanks, Allison. Great to see you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.